What's up, everybody? Welcome back to our series where we get into kratom addiction and trauma. In last week's video, we talked about the healing crisis, what that is, what it looked like for me, and what it could look like for you. And this week, I want to pick up with looking at the bigger picture of trauma, where it could be coming from, past the experiences that we've been through in our own lives. Because when I started to learn about this in my journey, it really helped me to start to wrap my mind around trauma from a bigger perspective. So my hope is that by sharing this with you, that it'll help you as well. So I want to start off with a quote that I came across at one point, and I love it so much. It's really resonated with me over the years. And that quote is, "Family dysfunction rolls down from generation to generation like a fire in the woods, taking down everything in its path until one person has the courage to turn and face the flames. And it's this person who brings peace to their ancestors and spares the children that follow." Man, that is so beautiful and deep. When I first came across it, I don't even remember where it was, to be honest, too. I don't know how I even heard this. I don't know who wrote it, but it just resonated so much with me. So that's what I want to talk about today is generational trauma, because this was something that as I started to understand it, it helped me to understand myself and my own situation. Because for a lot of us, our trauma goes a lot deeper than just the things that have happened to us in our lifetimes. So next I want to read what the American Psychological Association defines as generational trauma. Generational trauma is a phenomenon in which the descendants of a person who have experienced a terrifying event show adverse emotional and behavioral reactions to the event that are similar to those of the person that experienced it. These reactions vary by generation, but often include shame, increased anxiety and guilt, a heightened sense of a heightened sense of vulnerability and helplessness, low self-esteem, depression, suicidality. I think that's how you say that. Suicidality. Yes, that's how you say that. Substance abuse, which is very important, obviously, with today's discussion. Dissociation, hypervigilance, intrusive thoughts, difficulty with relationships and attachment to others, difficulty in regulating aggression, and extreme reactivity to stress. The exact mechanisms of the phenomenon remain unknown, but are believed to involve effects on relationship skills, personal behavior, and attitudes and beliefs that affect subsequent generations. The role of parental communication about the event and the nature of family functioning appear to be particularly important in trauma transmission. Research on generational trauma concentrated initially on the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of survivors of the Holocaust and Japanese American internment camps, but it has now broadened to include American Indian tribes, the families of Vietnam War veterans, and many others. This is also called historical trauma, multi-generational trauma, secondary traumatization, and intergenerational trauma. So this is deep, you guys. Like, this is, for me, when I started to wrap my mind around generational trauma, it was like it definitely had an impact on me, because when I started to see my trauma and what I was experiencing in my life as the ripple effect on top of not only the traumatic events that I had been through, but as the ripple effect of what was coming from generations before, it really was a game changer in my healing process. As far as being able to conceptualize and wrap my mind around where my trauma was coming from. And like it said in what we just read in this definition, that these reactions vary but often include shame, anxiety, guilt, heightened sense of vulnerability and helplessness, low self-esteem, depression, substance abuse, dissociation, hypervigilance, all of these things. When I started to see, okay, wow, there is something that is bigger and deeper than me that is playing out in my life that is, besides what I have been through personally, but there are things that are rippling out from these generations before me. And it really was a game changer in my healing, because I started to see that, like, some of these things that I was going through, of course, we all make decisions that have consequences. We all live those consequences, substance abuse being one of them. Even, it is to a certain extent a personal choice, the way that the things that we choose to focus on in our minds. And so, yes, there is a part of it that is our responsibility when it comes down to certain aspects of our personality and the way that we react and our emotions and those kind of things. But when you start to think about generational trauma and you start to think about what has happened in your lineage before you, it can really shine light on some different things about expressions of your personality, and things like shame, things like, substance abuse, like what we're focusing on a lot today, and all sorts of different things that run a lot deeper than just your choice to, make a decision and then there be consequences for it, or, just normal thought patterns in your mind. So today I want to encourage you to think about your generations before, your ancestors, your lineage. And if you have the option, look into it a little bit, because when I learned about what had happened in my family in the generations before me, when I started to understand what generational trauma was, it helped me to see that, okay, these things that happened in these generations before are rippling out into my everyday life. And so, for example, for me, my personal experience was that my grandfather was born in Cuba, and his family came over to the United States when, or shortly after Castro came into reign in Cuba. And it was under circumstances that were not ideal. As well, my grandfather lost his father tragically before my family then came to the US. And so that was part of what happened. There was, as with a lot of these like old school cultural roots that we have in our family, whatever, nationality you are, wherever your ancestors are, there is often a lot of abuse that went on, physical abuse, because, nowadays it's understood that, even on a legal level, that it is not okay to be physical with children, reprimand children in a physical way, especially when it steps into, abuse and violence and that kind of thing. But back in the day, and especially in these old school generations and wherever our families came from, it was very common for children to be beat, to be very frank. It was very common. Abuse was very common. I do in my family, in the Cuban side of my family, it was very common. And, depending on your religious background, whatever religion your family believes, your ancestors believed in, there was a lot of, physical reprimanding because it was in line with different religious beliefs. So that also was coming, down from generations before me. My grandmother, who married my Cuban grandfather, her mother abandon her family. My great-grandmother abandoned my grandmother and her siblings. My great-grandmother abandoned her family and just completely up and left the family and left the, my great-grandfather and then my grandmother and her siblings to fend for themselves. So that was something that happened as well. There was a lot of poverty too in that side of the family. Through my grandmother's side of the family. My grandfather, while in Cuba, they owned a plantation and were considered very wealthy. But then when they came to the US and, everything was seized by Castro, they lost all of, the wealth that they had in Cuba. So that was something that was very traumatic as well, and then resulted in different poverty type conditions and, lack of food and lack of, financial security. This was on my mom's side. On my dad's side, in the Italian side of the family, I don't really have a lot of information about that side of the family. But with my father and my grandparents, they were, Catholic, Italian, Irish family, and they had 5 kids. And my grandfather worked for Ford Motor Company, and he started off as a mechanic, and he ended up working his way up in the company over the years. But at first they didn't have a ton of money, and they put all of their kids in Catholic school. So there was food scarcity at different points, and it wasn't like, they were going without food, but with 5 kids, they're really, my grandmother would save money as best as she could, having all of those kids in private school. So my father wouldn't get, his fill of things. And so I noticed this all throughout my dad's life when he was still around, that he was always a food hoarder, in the sense that, like, it wasn't even in like a prepping sense. It was just that he would always have, like, shelves in our basement stocked up with non-perishable foods. And he always had this, I have a love for food, so I think I inherited that from him as well. He loved food, but there was this way with food that I think was a reflection of being raised that way, where he was not, given all that he needed food-wise. And because there were 5 kids, and my grandfather worked a lot, and my grandmother was one who was not very emotionally available to her children, there was a lot of emotional neglect. And so this is just explaining a little bit about my ancestors, and then what came down, to me. When it got to my mom and my dad, like I just explained about my dad a little bit, and then with my mom, the physical abuse that had come through my Cuban lineage, unfortunately affected her, because my grandfather, who over the years became the most docile, loving, gentle, wonderful man that I knew as my grandfather, when he was younger, he was very abusive, and he had very strong emotions. And he was a Spanish teacher, and my grandmother was a home economics teacher, so they didn't have a ton of money either. And I remember my mom talking about how they were raised on rice and beans, basically, because that's what they could afford. So there also was, not poverty conditions, because, they were working class basically, but they didn't have a ton of money. They were on teachers' salaries. So there was that going on. There, was the violence and abuse from my grandfather during that time. There were different aspects of the religion that my grandparents were on my mom's side. They were Seventh-day Adventists. And if you don't really know a lot about that, it's kind of steps into kind of like culty sort of territory, where the beliefs are very skewed, and they're based on like the prophet of the religion, which is this woman that was, supposedly receiving visions from God. So you can put 2 and 2 together, that religion wasn't wasn't that healthy to be devoted to and raised in like my mother was. And so there was a lot of restrictions in this religion too, where they were advised to be vegetarians, and they were advised to, like, there were all these weird rules, like women shouldn't wear like shorts or pants even, or skirts that came above a certain like length. So there was a lot of like oppression in this religion when my mom was growing up. And there were different aspects of the abuse that was going on for her. My mom has admitted to having eating disorders since the time that she was around 16 years old. And then that was, compiled on top of the already, restrictive dietary guidelines of this religion that they were in. So I'm just explaining about my lineage because when I came to the understanding and I looked at this very clearly, in the sense that, like, okay, there have been things that have happened to me in my lifetime, like I've said, but there's this ripple effect that is coming through in my life that I was then able to pinpoint and look at. And as this quote says that I love so much, that, this trauma is going to roll from generation to generation like a fire in the woods, taking down everything in its path until one person has the courage to turn and face the flames. And you guys, it was me who turned and faced the flames. And it may be you that it's time to turn and face the flames. Because when we realize that, okay, there was all of this stuff that has happened in my ancestors and in the generations before me, and nobody has really recognized this. Nobody has really taken a stand and turned and faced those flames and gone, okay, this is what has happened, and this is how it has rolled down like a fire in the woods from generation to generation. And facing those flames and saying, okay, what do I need to do to change? What do I need to do to make sure that this isn't passed down to the next generation, so that that fire keeps, destroying everything in its path? What do I need to do? So there was this very defining moment for me where I started to put two and two together, that this fire has been, destroying everything in the generations before me. And when I turned to face it, what was it that actually happened? And what was it that is being passed down to me? What do I need to do to address that and change that within myself? And what do I need to do to break the cycles of what has been passed on from generation to generation? So we're going to get into that more as we get on into this series about like different ways that I faced the fire. And I addressed the things that not only had happened to me, but had happened to my ancestors. And what I did to not only change myself, but not pass that on to my son, who is the next generation to follow. So it's going to be cool as we get into this. And I've said it in these other videos that, you guys, this is heavy duty work. This is heavy duty stuff. Like, when we find ourselves in these addictions, whether it be kratom or anything else for that matter, this fire has been destroying everything before us, and it has almost destroyed us. And our addictions and our substance abuse issues are coping mechanisms partly for the trauma that not only we've been through, but is, coming down from the generations that have come before us. So that's going to be something that we're going to discuss actually in the next video, that kratom addiction and substance abuse is a coping mechanism for trauma. And we're going to talk about how that happens. And we're also, as we go on in this series, like, you guys know I love God, and I am so down with my faith. But when it comes down to this kind of stuff, I also like to look at it very logically. And so we're going to be breaking down like the mental and the actual makeup of our brains, and not only the neurochemistry, but how our brains are formed, and then how trauma affects that. Because for me, when I learned about that, and I learned about that, like, actually when we are traumatized individuals, I wouldn't go as far as to say brain damage, but our brains are affected by trauma. The way that our brains form, the way that our brains react and think, and the way that our then neurochemicals respond to the brain being formed like that, it's an impairment basically. And I'm not saying that it's on the same lines as like a disability, but actually in a sense it may be. Because you guys, if you have experienced trauma, like I have, our brains are different than someone who has not experienced trauma. And the way that our brains and then in turn our bodies respond to everything around us is going to be different than someone who has not experienced trauma. So we're going to also get into that, because as I've learned more about this, it has shown so much light on the way that I think, the way that I act, the way that I respond to things. Because that's my hope and my intention for this series, is that as we get into these different videos to come, we're going to hopefully, shine light on this for all of us, where if we see how things, work within ourselves, if we see the way that our brains are working and the way that our bodies and our nervous systems are responding, and then what's to come after that, we're going to get into behavioral aspects of, what then, our brains are working this way, our bodies are working this way. So then we are responding behaviorally. We are responding emotionally to things. And the way that we are responding is different than somebody who is not traumatized. So when we can start to shine light on this and make sense of like, okay, this is the way that I'm thinking. Because, the way that you think, it's, you can't, unless you really start to like try to understand it, the way that we think is the way that we think. The way that we act is the way that we act. And the way that our bodies respond is the way that our bodies respond. And when we're just living in this, place of basically PTSD and complex PTSD, CPTSD, we're not going to know that we are doing these things. So when we take a look at not only our brains and then our neurochemistry and then the way that we are responding, because that's where our, emotions and our behaviors are rooted in. When we can look at this clearly, we are able to start to unravel what it is to experience trauma. And then when we start to do this, we can start to change different things about ourselves. It's not going to happen overnight, you guys. I am not perfect. I said in the first video, I sit before you a whole, happy, joyful person. Yes, that's true. But I still have PTSD. I still have CPTSD. And I'm still a human being made of flesh and blood. And so I am never going to be perfect, obviously. And my reactions to different things, it is an everyday thing, you guys, to focus on this, to go, okay, I understand this is the way that my brain is working. I understand this is the way that I'm reacting and that my emotions are. So it is a constant process. So this isn't going to be easy, but I hope that together, because I'm in this with you, we are able to get to the root of what our trauma is and then look at how it's affected us mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, all these different aspects. And then we can start to work on changing together. So I'll see you in the next video where we pick up with trauma as a coping mechanism and as a self-medication. Or pardon me, I didn't say that right. Sorry, I'm super tired this morning, guys. So if I'm stumbling over my words, I apologize. The next video is going to be addiction, kratom addiction, and substance abuse as self-medication for trauma. Sorry about that. All right, love you guys. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.